You're looking at a daguerreotype from October 1874, taken outside St. Bartholomew's Cemetery in Millbrook Township, Massachusetts. The photographer was Ezra Whitman, documenting grave markers for the township records. But what you see in the lower left corner defies every natural law. There stands 8-year-old Thomas Aldrich, his small finger pointing directly at a patch of bare earth. His mouth is open, as if calling out a name. The cemetery ledger shows no burial planned for that spot. No grave had been commissioned, no plot sold, no headstone ordered. Yet 3 days later, on October 15, 1874, groundskeeper Josiah Crane would break the first shovel of dirt in that exact location. The burial was for Thomas Aldrich himself. Experts who examined this photograph in 1923 found no evidence of tampering or double exposure. The silver nitrate showed a single, continuous capture. Dr. Cornelius Hartford of the Boston Institute of Photographic Sciences called it an impossibility rendered permanent. But what truly disturbed investigators was not the boy's presence in the image. It was the shadow he cast. The shadow fell toward the cemetery gates, though the sun that day was positioned behind them. And in that shadow, if you look carefully, you can see the outline of a small coffin. Thomas Aldrich had pointed to his own grave 3 days before anyone knew he would need one. The boy, who should have been playing in his mother's garden, was instead marking the spot of his own burial. What you're about to hear are the documented facts of a case that forced the township of Millbrook to seal its cemetery records for 50 years. A case where a child's final act was to predict his own death with photographic precision. A case that suggests some knowledge transcends the boundary between life and whatever lies beyond. The photograph still exists, housed in the basement archives of the Millbrook Historical Society. But the grave Thomas pointed to remains empty to this day. Because when they opened his coffin in 1949 for cemetery renovations, they found only an empty pine box, and carved into the wood, in a child's uncertain hand, were the words, "I told you where to look." No one has ever explained how Thomas Aldrich knew where he would be buried before he died, or why his body vanished from a grave he himself had chosen. The autumn of 1874 found New England in the grip of rapid industrial change. Steam locomotives now connected Boston to the smallest farming townships, carrying news, commerce, and strangers to places that had known only familiar faces for generations. Photography, though still expensive and cumbersome, was becoming the preferred method for documenting property records and family histories. The daguerreotype process required subjects to remain perfectly still for several minutes, making any accidental presence in a photograph virtually impossible. Dr. Elias Thornfield's medical journal from that period describes an unusually high number of childhood fevers in the Connecticut River Valley. His notes, discovered in 1968 during the demolition of Millbrook's old physician's quarters, reference peculiar symptoms of delirium involving prophetic utterances. The parish register of St. Bartholomew's shows 17 child deaths between September and November of 1874, but only one entry carries the notation, "Subject exhibited foreknowledge of burial arrangements prior to onset of final illness." That notation appears beside the name Thomas Aldrich, written in the careful script of Pastor Jeremiah Wainwright. Pastor Wainwright's sealed letter to the Diocese of Worcester, found in church archives in 1954, describes disturbing incidents of temporal displacement affecting the youngest members of our congregation. He requested immediate guidance on children who speak of their own funerals with unseemly accuracy. The diocese's response, if any existed, was never located. What survived instead were Wainwright's private journals, detailing his growing conviction that something unnatural had taken hold in Millbrook. He wrote of children drawing pictures of graveyards before they fell ill, of young voices reciting burial prayers they had never been taught, of small hands reaching toward windows that faced the cemetery, even from houses with no view of the grounds. The medical understanding of childhood illness in 1874 attributed such behaviors to nervous fever and inflammation of the brain. But Dr. Thornfield's notes suggest he suspected something beyond conventional pathology. His final entry before Thomas Aldrich's death reads, "The boy speaks of his grave as if it were a destination he has already visited." What if our children are not prophesying their deaths, but remembering them? October 12, 1874 began with unseasonable warmth and a thin morning fog that clung to the cemetery grounds. Ezra Whitman arrived at St. Bartholomew's at precisely 9:30 a.m., carrying his camera equipment in a wheeled cart borrowed from the township blacksmith. The air temperature was 64 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light southwest wind that dispersed the fog by 10:15 a.m. Whitman's photographic log, preserved in the Millbrook Township Hall, records optimal lighting conditions and no atmospheric disturbances. He began documenting headstones in the cemetery's northwest section, working systematically toward the newer graves along the eastern border. At 11:47 a.m., Whitman prepared to photograph a cluster of recent markers near the cemetery's main path. He positioned his camera on its tripod, adjusted the lens focus, and loaded a fresh silver-coated copper plate. The required exposure time for the available light was calculated at 4 minutes and 30 seconds. According to his notes, no living person was present in the cemetery during this session. Yet when Whitman developed the plate that evening in his makeshift darkroom, Thomas Aldrich appeared in perfect clarity. The boy stood 17 feet from the camera, his right arm extended, index finger pointing toward an unmarked section of ground. His clothing showed no motion blur, suggesting he had maintained that precise position throughout the entire exposure. Mrs. Eleanor Aldrich, when shown the photograph 2 days later, confirmed the clothing matched Thomas's Sunday vest and knickers, but she swore under oath that her son had been home with a mild fever all of October 12th. Dr. Thornfield's examination notes from that date corroborate her account. Patient confined to bed with elevated temperature and complaints of exhaustion. The physician recorded Thomas's temperature at 101.2 degrees at 11 a.m., the same time Ezra Whitman was preparing his camera equipment in a cemetery 2 miles from the Aldrich home. Whitman himself never claimed to have seen the boy during the photographic session. He described the cemetery as empty of all human presence save myself in his written testimony to Township Constable Marcus Webb. Yet there Thomas stood in the developed image, pointing with impossible precision to a plot of earth. A plot that would receive its first and only burial 3 days later. The silver nitrate analysis was conducted by Professor Henry Blackwood of the Hartford College of Natural Sciences on November 8, 1874. Using a Zeiss optical microscope with 200 times magnification, Professor Blackwood examined every square inch of Whitman's daguerreotype plate. His report, filed with the Massachusetts State Board of Health, found no evidence of chemical tampering, overlay techniques, or multiple exposures. The silver deposits showed uniform density consistent with a single, uninterrupted capture of light. Professor Blackwood noted one anomaly in his technical assessment. The boy's shadow fell at a 47-degree angle toward the cemetery gates. Astronomical calculations for October 12, 1874, placed the sun at a 23-degree elevation in the southeast at 11:47 a.m. Any shadow cast at that time should have fallen toward the northwest, not toward the gates. The shadow's direction suggests a light source positioned where no light source existed, Blackwood wrote in his confidential addendum. Dr. Margaret Fairchild of the Boston Women's Medical College examined the photograph through a different lens. As one of New England's few specialists in childhood nervous disorders, she focused on Thomas Aldrich's facial expression and posture. Her analysis, submitted to the Massachusetts Medical Society in December 1874, described indicators of somnambulistic behavior. The boy's eyes, she noted, appeared unfocused, as if viewing something beyond the immediate environment. His mouth was positioned as if speaking, though daguerreotypes could not capture sound. Dr. Fairchild's most disturbing observation concerned the angle of Thomas's pointing finger. Geometric analysis showed he was indicating a spot exactly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, the precise dimensions of a child's grave. Meanwhile, Township Surveyor Isaiah Crawford conducted his own investigation of the cemetery grounds. His measurements, recorded in the Township Land Registry, confirmed that Thomas's finger pointed to coordinates that corresponded to no existing grave plot. The cemetery's official layout, established in 1847, showed that section as designated green space. No burials were permitted or planned for that area according to the Cemetery Commission's records. Crawford's survey equipment detected no underground disturbances, no previous excavations, and no existing grave markers. Yet the boy pointed to that spot with the confidence of someone reading from a map. 3 competing theories emerged to explain Thomas Aldrich's impossible presence in Whitman's photograph. The first, championed by Dr. Cornelius Hartford of the Boston Institute of Photographic Sciences, proposed a temporal displacement of light reflection. Hartford theorized that under specific atmospheric conditions, light could bend through fog and moisture, creating mirror-like projections of distant subjects. This would explain how Thomas, bedridden 2 miles away, could appear in the cemetery photograph. Supporting evidence included the unusual morning fog and the 64-degree temperature that created optimal conditions for optical distortion. However, Hartford's theory failed to account for the boy's precise pointing gesture toward an unmarked gravesite. The second theory, advanced by Township Constable Marcus Webb, suggested deliberate deception. Webb proposed that the Aldrich family had staged the photograph to support an insurance claim or property dispute. He noted that the cemetery's eastern section was being considered for expansion, potentially increasing adjacent property values. Mrs. Eleanor Aldrich did own a small plot of land bordering the cemetery's proposed expansion area, but Webb's investigation revealed no insurance policies on Thomas, no pending property transactions, and no financial motive for the family. Moreover, Ezra Whitman's reputation for honesty was unimpeachable, and he had no known connection to the Aldrich family. The third theory emerged from Pastor Jeremiah Wainwright's correspondence with the Diocese of Worcester. Wainwright proposed that Thomas had experienced what he termed a visitation from the realm beyond the veil. He cited similar cases in church literature where the dying had demonstrated foreknowledge of their burial arrangements. In support, he offered testimonies from other Millbrook families whose children had exhibited prophetic behaviors before succumbing to fever. 7-year-old Mary Fletcher had drawn a picture of her own headstone 2 weeks before her death. 9-year-old Samuel Hart had asked his mother to purchase white lilies for his funeral service before showing any symptoms of illness. Yet Wainwright's theory required accepting the existence of supernatural communication between the living and the dead. Each explanation demanded the rejection of either physical law, human honesty, or scientific materialism. At 3:17 a.m. on October 15, 1874, Thomas Aldrich sat upright in his bed and spoke his final words. His mother, keeping vigil beside him, recorded his exact statement in a letter to her sister. "The man with the shovel is coming now." Outside the Aldrich farmhouse, the temperature had dropped to 31 degrees and a hard frost covered the cemetery grounds 2 miles away. Mrs. Aldrich felt the sudden chill enter Thomas's bedroom, though no windows were open and the fire still burned in the hearth. The boy's breathing had been labored for hours, but in that moment it became perfectly regular. He turned his head toward the east wall, the wall that faced St. Bartholomew's Cemetery, and smiled. "Mother," he whispered, "I can see where they're digging." At that precise moment, groundskeeper Josiah Crane was walking the cemetery perimeter on his nightly rounds. Crane later testified to Constable Webb that he heard the sound of metal striking earth coming from the unmarked section. He investigated with his lantern but found no one present and no evidence of disturbance. Yet, when he returned to check the same spot at dawn, he discovered a shallow depression in the earth. The depression measured exactly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. Dr. Thornfield arrived at the Aldrich house at 4:20 a.m. to find Thomas had died peacefully. The boy's body showed no signs of struggle or distress, only the peaceful expression of someone who had completed a long journey. But when Thornfield lifted Thomas's right hand to check for rigor mortis, he found dirt under the child's fingernails. Clean dirt, as if freshly turned, though Thomas had not left his bed in 3 days. The physician collected samples of the soil and later had it analyzed by the Massachusetts Agricultural College. The dirt matched the mineral composition of soil found specifically in St. Bartholomew's Cemetery. More precisely, it matched soil from the eastern section where Thomas had pointed in Whitman's photograph. Mrs. Aldrich insisted on viewing her son's body one final time before the coffin was sealed. She later described an unusual detail to Pastor Wainwright. Thomas's lips were curved in a slight smile, and there was something in his closed fist that hadn't been there when he died. A small stone, perfectly round, that she had never seen before, but somehow recognized. The burial of Thomas Aldrich proceeded on October 17, 1874, under overcast skies and a steady drizzle. Pastor Wainwright conducted the service for 37 mourners, including representatives from 6 families who had lost children to the autumn fever. The grave had been dug by Josiah Crane and his assistant, Samuel Morse, in the exact location where Thomas had pointed in Whitman's photograph. Township records show the burial plot was purchased by Eleanor Aldrich on October 16th, the day after her son's death. But cemetery commission minutes reveal an unusual detail. Mrs. Aldrich requested that specific plot by its precise coordinates. She provided measurements that matched Crane's existing depression in the earth to within 3 inches. During the lowering of the coffin, Pastor Wainwright noted that the grave seemed to fit the wooden box with unusual precision. No additional digging was required, no adjustments made to accommodate the coffin's dimensions. As if the earth had been prepared by someone who knew exactly what size grave would be needed, he wrote in his journal. Mrs. Aldrich requested that Thomas be buried with the small round stone found in his hand. The stone, examined by Township Surveyor Isaiah Crawford, was identified as limestone of a type not naturally occurring in Massachusetts. Chemical analysis conducted at Harvard College's Geological Laboratory traced its origin to quarries in western Pennsylvania. No one could explain how Thomas had acquired a stone from quarries located 400 miles away. 3 months after the burial, groundskeeper Crane reported unusual activity around Thomas's grave. Fresh flowers appeared on the headstone each morning, though no family members admitted to placing them. The flowers were consistently white lilies, which did not grow naturally in the region and were not available from local vendors in winter. More disturbing were Crane's reports of hearing a child's voice calling from the cemetery after midnight. The voice seemed to originate from the direction of Thomas's grave, though no living child was ever seen on the grounds. Constable Webb investigated these reports but found only disturbed earth around the headstone. The disturbances suggested someone had been digging near the grave, though no tools or footprints were discovered. On February 14, 1875, exactly 4 months after Thomas's burial, Crane made his most unsettling discovery. The headstone bore a new inscription that no one remembered commissioning or carving. The unauthorized inscription appeared below Thomas Aldrich's name and dates, carved in the same script style as the original memorial. It read, "He pointed the way for those who followed." Monument carver Ephraim Walsh, who had created the original headstone, swore he had never been commissioned for additional work. The granite showed no tool marks or evidence of recent carving, as if the words had been present since the stone's installation. Pastor Wainwright documented 7 more child deaths in Millbrook between November 1874 and March 1875. Each child, he noted, had exhibited the same prophetic behaviors as Thomas Aldrich before succumbing to fever. They drew pictures of cemetery plots, spoke of funeral arrangements, and pointed toward St. Bartholomew's grounds with disturbing accuracy. Most unsettling, each child requested to be buried near the boy who knew where to look. Their graves now formed a semicircle around Thomas's plot, creating what groundskeeper Crane described as a congregation of the departed. In April 1875, the Massachusetts State Board of Health ordered an investigation into the unusually high child mortality rate in Millbrook Township. Dr. Robert Henley of Boston Medical College arrived to conduct examinations and interviews with surviving family members. His preliminary report noted behavioral patterns suggesting shared delusion or environmental contamination. But Henley's private correspondence, discovered in 1932, revealed his growing conviction that something beyond medical science was affecting Millbrook's children. He wrote to a colleague, "They all describe the same vision, a boy in a cemetery pointing toward empty ground that becomes their final resting place." The investigation was suspended abruptly in May 1875, when Dr. Henley himself fell ill with fever. His final lucid statement to his assistant was, "I can see where they're digging my grave." Henley died 3 days later and was buried in Boston's Mount Auburn Cemetery, 80 miles from Millbrook. But witnesses at his funeral reported hearing a child's voice calling from the direction of Thomas Aldrich's distant grave. The voice seemed to carry across the miles, offering directions to visitors who had never been to St. Bartholomew's Cemetery. Township officials sealed the cemetery to outside visitors in June 1875 and restricted access to family members only. But the children of Millbrook continued to point toward the graves that awaited them. The sealed records of St. Bartholomew's Cemetery remained untouched until December 1949, when township renovations required relocation of graves in the eastern section. Construction supervisor Martin Hayes hired the Pemberton Memorial Company to exhume and re-enter 17 children's graves, including Thomas Aldrich's plot. On December 3, 1949, excavation began under the supervision of Dr. Catherine Morrison, the state-appointed forensic examiner. Hayes's work log, preserved in the Millbrook Municipal Archives, records the discovery at 2:15 p.m. Thomas Aldrich's coffin was empty. The pine box remained intact, showing no signs of decay appropriate for a 75-year burial. The coffin's interior appeared freshly lined, as if prepared for a burial that had never taken place. Dr. Morrison's examination revealed no evidence of grave robbing, no disturbance of the surrounding earth, and no alternate burial sites nearby. Most puzzling was the condition of the coffin's interior wood, smooth and unmarked except for a single carved inscription. The words, "I told you where to look," appeared on the inner lid, carved in what handwriting analysis confirmed as a child's uncertain script. The carving showed no signs of aging and appeared to have been made recently, despite the coffin's 75-year interment. Adjacent graves, when opened, contained intact remains consistent with their burial dates. Only Thomas Aldrich's grave held an empty coffin with a message carved from within. Dr. Morrison ordered a complete excavation of the plot to a depth of 12 feet, searching for any trace of the missing remains. The excavation revealed virgin soil beneath the coffin level, untouched by previous digging. Chemical analysis of the soil showed no decomposition byproducts, no calcium deposits, and no evidence that human remains had ever been present. Hayes reported his findings to the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, recommending a full investigation. The department's response, dated January 15, 1950, classified the incident as administrative error in burial documentation. Official records were amended to indicate that Thomas Aldrich's remains had been relocated to an undisclosed family plot in 1875. But no documentation of such a relocation existed in township, church, or family records. The empty coffin was reburied in an unmarked grave in the cemetery's maintenance section. The carved message, however, was photographed and filed in a folder marked Unexplained Findings. Between 1950 and 1987, St. Bartholomew's Cemetery experienced 17 documented cases of visitors claiming to see a young boy pointing toward unmarked sections of the grounds. The Millbrook Historical Society's incident reports describe consistent details: a child in 1870s clothing, standing near the eastern section, gesturing toward empty ground. Witnesses included groundskeepers, mourners, and genealogical researchers, none of whom had prior knowledge of the Thomas Aldrich case. Photography professor James Whitaker of nearby Amherst College investigated these sightings in 1961 as part of a study on pareidolia and cemetery folklore. Whitaker set up time-lapse cameras throughout the cemetery over 6 months, capturing more than 3,000 hours of footage. His final report, published in the Journal of Anomalous Phenomena, documented 12 instances of unexplained visual anomalies near Thomas's original gravesite. The anomalies appeared as translucent figures visible only in specific lighting conditions between 11:30 a.m. and 12 p.m. Enhanced analysis revealed the figures maintained consistent proportions and positioning across multiple occurrences. Most significantly, each figure appeared to be pointing toward different sections of empty ground throughout the cemetery. Whitaker's measurements showed the pointing directions corresponded precisely to plots that were later sold for burials within the following year. Cemetery records confirmed that 7 families purchased plots in locations indicated by the anomalous figures without prior knowledge of the sightings. In 1973, genealogist Eleanor Hayes, no relation to construction supervisor Martin Hayes, discovered Ezra Whitman's original photographic plates in her grandmother's estate. The plates included not only the famous daguerreotype of Thomas Aldrich, but also 12 other cemetery photographs from October 1874. Each additional photograph contained the image of Thomas Aldrich pointing toward different sections of St. Bartholomew's grounds. Cross-referencing with cemetery burial records revealed that all 12 locations received their first burials between November 1874 and June 1875. The children buried in those plots were the same 7 who had exhibited prophetic behaviors before their deaths, plus 5 additional fever victims. Dr. Patricia Jameson of the University of Massachusetts Paranormal Research Department examined the complete photographic collection in 1985. Her analysis confirmed that all 13 plates showed identical chemical signatures, proving they were captured during the same photographic session. Thomas Aldrich had somehow appeared in multiple photographs simultaneously, pointing to 13 different graves that had not yet been dug. Today, a digitized scan of Ezra Whitman's original daguerreotype hangs in the main display case of the Millbrook Historical Society's basement archive. Visitors can examine the photograph under magnification, studying Thomas Aldrich's pointing gesture and impossible shadow in climate-controlled preservation conditions. The museum's guest book contains hundreds of entries from researchers, skeptics, and believers, all seeking to understand how a child predicted his own burial location. Dr. Michael Chen, the Society's current curator, reports that the photograph continues to yield new mysteries under modern forensic analysis. Digital enhancement techniques unavailable to 19th century investigators have revealed additional details in Thomas's facial expression and posture. The boy's eyes, when magnified 500 times, appear to be looking directly at the camera lens, as if aware he was being photographed. More unsettling is the discovery of what appears to be movement blur around Thomas's pointing finger, suggesting motion during what should have been a static exposure. Recent ground-penetrating radar surveys of St. Bartholomew's Cemetery have identified 17 unmarked depressions in the eastern section. Each depression measures exactly 6 feet by 3 feet and lies precisely where Thomas pointed in Whitman's 13 photographs. The depressions contain no burial remains, no coffins, and no evidence of excavation, yet they persist despite decades of groundskeeping and maintenance. Local families continue to report children drawing pictures of cemetery plots before falling ill, though modern medicine has largely eliminated the fever outbreaks of 1874. The drawings invariably depict the eastern section of St. Bartholomew's, complete with headstones that do not yet exist. Child psychologists have studied these cases extensively but can offer no explanation for the consistent imagery and geographical accuracy. Perhaps Thomas Aldrich discovered something that October Day in 1874, a thin place where the boundary between life and death becomes permeable. Perhaps some children possess the ability to see across that boundary, to glimpse the destinations that await them. Or perhaps the boy who pointed to a grave that hadn't been dug yet is still pointing, still guiding those who follow toward their predetermined resting places. The next time you visit an old cemetery and feel the sensation of being watched, look carefully at the empty ground. Someone may already know exactly where you belong. The question is whether you're ready to see them pointing. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe and turn on notifications for the next file. Disclaimer: this script is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, institutions, and incidents are invented or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental, created solely for entertainment.